Just kidding. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're gonna just take a couple minutes just to let everyone hop in, get settled in, and then we're gonna get started. Just a few minutes. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. Welcome, everybody. We're just gonna take a couple more minutes just to let everyone make their way into the webinar and get settled in, and then we'll get started. Hello from Saskatoon. Hello. We're just going to give it one more minute. We'll let a couple more people roll in here, and then we're going to get started. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you here with us. My name is Allison Blair, and I'm the program coordinator for NEST. And I want to welcome all of you to today's workshop. I just want to start with letting you all know who we are at NEST and a little bit about the work that we do. NEST is a nonprofit, and we work throughout the United States. The core of our work is educational programming focused on prevention of child sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. This includes youth-facing curricula, teacher training materials, parent resources, student leadership opportunities, victim assistance, and school policy support. If you'd like to know more about any of our lessons, any of our programming or offerings, please feel free to reach out to us. We're going to be dropping all of our contact information in the chat, and you'll see it in a slide later on in the presentation. And obviously we will follow up after the presentation as well. So we're offering these virtual workshops in response to needs from our educators that we've heard over the past couple of years during this pandemic. And the goal is really to provide you support and to give everyone here today some new tools and some new insights, hopefully. So a couple of housekeeping things just before we jump in. We're going to be recording today's webinar, and that'll be available following this session. It'll be available on our website. And also at the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A button. Please use this to share any questions throughout the workshop that come up for you. And we're going to have some time at the end to discuss anything that comes up, to go through some of your questions with our amazing panelists and presenters. And also, if you need English subtitles or a live transcript, you can turn them on via your menu at the bottom of your screen. And also, my colleague Kate is going to be helping moderate during today's presentation. So please feel free to drop any questions or issues you might be having in the chat. You can message her directly. You can message any of us that you might see that have a nest next to their names, and we'll be able to help you. And we know that there is tremendous knowledge and expertise in this group from all of you. So please, if there's something you'd like to share, if something really resonates with you, please feel free to drop it in the chat box or drop it in the Q&A box below. So now I'm going to go ahead and welcome our amazing panelists. We have with us today, Moe and Sara Benincasa, and I will let John go ahead and get started and introduce himself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thanks to everybody at Nest for having me today. I am not a doctor. I'm not a professional psychiatrist. I have a podcast I've been doing for several years. The podcast is called Depeche Mode, and I talk to people about mental health. I've been in journalism for a long time, and I've been very interested in the power of people telling their stories and connecting with one another on the subject of mental health, because not only is it a great way to spread information, but it's how we support each other. We're a social species. So be sure to check out Depeche Mode. I also have a memoir out called The Hilarious World of Depression, which has jokes in it, and hopefully it'll help people in some way. But all of that book was written before COVID. And since COVID has happened, I've been very interested in the idea of how long it will be with us after the virus isn't so much with us. How long will it live in our minds after it's mostly gone from our bodies? A friend of mine, Kelsey Dara, was on one of our first shows and told me about her grandmother who had gone through the Great Depression, and later in life, was economically comfortable, financially comfortable, but would save pizza crusts. If the family had pizza and left the crusts, their grandmother would collect the crusts in a Ziploc bag and put it in the freezer. And when they would ask, "Grandma, why are you doing that?" And she said, "Well, maybe there won't be any bread in the future. I need to save the bread." And I think that's the kind of thing that we can expect. She had lived through that experience, and even though it made no rational sense to save bread, she saved bread, because what if the bread is gone? And that's what I've been thinking about. The Omicron variant, I'm seeing better and better news in terms of how it's fading. Of course, like a lot of people, when I heard about the Omicron variant, I thought it sounded like a 1970s movie, like a thriller starring Donald Sutherland or Faye Dunaway. Maybe Dennis Hopper played the bad guy. And I watched, and I was horrified, and it was more contagious than what had come before it. And the vaccine helped. At least it helped lessen the effects of it. And I watched as a lot of people who could get the vaccine chose not to do it. And I was dismayed, and it ate away at my sense of safety, and it ate away at my sense of public safety when not everybody was on board and rowing the same boat. And I think it ate away at that sense of safety faster because that sense of safety had already been eroded so much over the last couple of years of COVID. Um, we have watched what's been happening and we've tried to process it, and it's been impossible, I think. 900,000 people dead in America, where I live, probably a lot more than that. People lost jobs and homes. Life has been turned upside down. And it's more than we can really process. As a society, we have evolved quickly. Technology has evolved quickly. We got airplanes and freeways and the internet and space travel all within the last handful of decades. It's amazing. As a society, as inventors, we shoot way ahead. As an organism, as a human being, as a collection of human beings, I don't think we can move that fast. When you think of how the science of evolution works, it takes a lot longer. We don't know what to do with the idea of massive amounts of death on this scale. Like, we can't comprehend it. The organ that is the brain can't handle it because it doesn't have experience way back in the olden days of processing that kind of information. And so the brain is then being asked to do way more than it's capable of doing. And when it's met up against something that is beyond its comprehension, that's when trauma happens. And that's when it gets stuffed away, and then it imprecisely bubbles to the surface for a long time after that. In regard to COVID and mental health, things have been horrible for the last couple of years, as I think you know, and they're evolving to become more forms of horrible. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm also going to talk about how I am very, very hopeful in this situation. We're going to talk about the horrible first. I want to lay the groundwork with the horrible. And I promise you, I'm going to get back to the hope because I'm more hopeful than I've ever been. We are going to contain the enemy of COVID-19 after a long and horrible war. I don't know the exact future. I don't know if more variants are on the way, but we're going to win ultimately in terms of fighting the virus. And then we're going to face the ghost of that enemy in the form of the traumatic stress that gets left behind. We're all going to be at a higher risk for mental disorders. Our daily function is going to be affected, and it will be this way for decades. There's a dire shortage of mental health professionals to help us through it also. And I'm hopeful. I'll get to the hope. I promise I am hopeful. But let me first illustrate trauma a little bit. Through anecdote, not through anything graphic, don't worry. Trauma. When I was 9 years old, my best friend shot me in the chest from point blank range. Small caveat, it was with a BB gun. But still, Dean and I had this allegedly unloaded BB gun that you pump up. You kind of have the handle and you... And what we were doing one summer day is shooting each other with compressed air because we're super smart. So it was unloaded. We would, pump it up and then feel the blast of air on our chest and go, oh, wow, that's crazy. And then we went off and did something else. While we were gone, the BB gun, which belonged to my brother, was picked up by my brother, who filled it with BBs and went and probably shot army men in the backyard or something, unbeknownst to us. Later in the day, we said, hey, let's do that BB gun thing again. Dean pumps it up 7 times, shoots me in the chest, and something was wrong right away. It hurt. My white Hanes t-shirt showed a trickle of blood that blossomed across the cotton, and I was hustled to the car and the hospital, and Dean had to live with thinking that he had just killed his best friend, and I had to live with thinking maybe Dean had just killed his best friend. And x-rays were taken and showed that the BB was wedged in a section of muscle about an inch from my heart. And I don't know if I would have died if it had hit my heart, but that was sort of the belief that I developed right there on the spot, that I was an inch away from death. The BB's still there. It's come up on MRIs. It confuses MRI technicians. But after that day, I stopped touching BB guns. I never wanted to play with another BB gun because that sight triggered something in my brain that said, you're going to die if you get near one of those things. So fast forward to my early 20s. My older sister has had 4 kids in a pretty short span, all boys. And these are typical boys. They're fond of roughhousing and wrestling around. My sister happens to be a pacifist. She and her husband don't want to give the kids any guns. And so the boys don't know what a gun is, but they find like long sticks or they find celery or carrots and insist that these are their shooters, because it turns out that a boy deprived of guns will invent guns. And so they want to play shooters with their cool uncle, with their young uncle. But when they point a stick at me and they say, this is a shooter, I feel a wave of panic blast through me. And I walk briskly away, which makes the game more fun for them. So they chase after me and they say, no, we got our shooters. You can't run away. You can't escape from us. And I say, oh, put that away. And then they keep on going. And I finally just turn and yell at them. Don't point that at me ever. I'm not going to replicate the volume that I use because my microphone would blow out. And at that point, the game is over and they start to cry. And I kind of do too, because what just happened? It was the same feeling that would come back whenever any toy gun got pointed anywhere near me. My breath would stop short. I'd mentally scan my chest for holes. When I had a son of my own years later, the kid got a lot of Legos. And this is trauma. This is how trauma works. A celery stick pointed at me poses no threat, but the trauma stays in the body. The brain remembers the feeling in the body and sends signals forever. And in my case, a 9-year-old was, to his belief, close to death and never forgot it and never stopped making those associations. And so now, these days, I think we've all been shot by that BB gun, and we're all at risk of freaking out from those celery sticks for a long time to come. It's a metaphor. I don't mean that we're all going to be afraid of celery. That's not one of the complications of COVID, don't worry. But in 10 years, 20 years, if you see an N95 mask, what are you going to think of? A little piece of fabric that is going to bring back memories of hundreds of thousands, millions around the world dead and society turned on its head. You will clench up. You will wonder where your mask is, even if by that point you haven't worn one in years and don't own any. So we're going to get ready for that today. We're going to get ready for how we're going to feel. Trauma is an emotional response, and this is definitionally emotional response to a catastrophic event that is too overwhelming for a brain to make sense of, so the brain sets it aside. It can be a jolt of an event like a physical assault or car accident, a single sudden monumental event. That's known as acute trauma. Chronic trauma, that's when events get repeated, same events get repeated over and over, an abusive situation in the home that involves repeated assaults over time, chronic trauma. And then there's complex trauma. And this is the one that I've been paying the most attention to as I think about how we're all going to be affected by COVID. Complex trauma is multiple varied traumatic experiences over a long period of time. Think alcoholic parent. One night it's not knowing where the parent is. Another time it means the parent loses a job. Maybe you have to move suddenly. Varied manifestations that rot away your sense of safety. And I think that's where we are together. With complex trauma, we see problems maintaining healthy relationships, and we see performance issues at work or school. A friend of mine, this is anecdotal, but a friend of mine is works with couples on the verge of divorce and tries to negotiate things, tries to come to some settlements one way or another. And their calendar has never been more full. People are dropping out of school in record numbers. People are flunking out of higher education institutions in record numbers. And of course, the great resignation has been upon us for a while, where people are sick of their jobs and are quitting. August of last year was the highest month of incidents of people quitting their jobs that we've ever had in American history. So we see what we know of the side effects of complex trauma, we see being borne out in society. We've been in a prolonged period where things were broken, and we more or less had to pretend that they weren't. It's the chronic, complex trauma of not being able to count on the fundamentals of life that we've been in. Now, important caveat, trauma is an individual phenomenon. It's not a societal phenomenon. A friend of mine, Dr. Ken Duckworth from NAMI, says, let's keep an eye on this as complex trauma. Let's think of this as trauma with a lowercase t, but let's pay attention to all the similarities. And we all handle things differently in every situation. But therapists I know, doctors I know, tell me that the response that they're seeing right now, today, is consistent with a traumatic reaction. So things shut down almost 2 years ago now, March of 2020. And we all have stories about where we were when those calls started coming to get out of the office, get out of the classroom. We all got very unreasonable about toilet paper. It was, it's a story that we'll tell our grandkids as we implore them to save their pizza crusts and put them in the freezer. And then we lived like that. And it was horrible to live in that position of staying home as much as possible, isolating as much as possible, because our brains don't want to do that. We want to find other people. It will feel safer if we find other people. And instead we had to fear other people, which seemed like a rational thing to do in that moment, even though it went against our nature. And now we have the vaccine, and we have to fear the fallout of the people who are eligible for it but haven't taken it. And we've had to try to make sense of all this death and loss and fear. And it's been really hard, and it's messing us up. And we can say, oh, we're getting through it as best we can, but we've taken on some heavy damage. And I think it makes a lot of sense to plan for the future by recognizing the damage that has already been done. I think that will make your future brighter than just pretending that it hasn't happened. I think that if you hear the engine grinding in your car and the check engine light come on, the response is not to crank up the radio and put a piece of black electrical tape over that light. I think you need to pull over and get your car looked at. The CDC has been doing ongoing research, a kind of rolling survey asking basically, how are you doing, everybody? And America has answered, not so great. And that's especially the case with children and young adults. Over 22% of responders overall are reporting clinically significant depression symptoms, 35% in ages 18 to 29. I know statistics can be hard when all it is somebody saying them to you. I have a very brief stats section here, don't worry. So 22% overall. Before COVID, similar survey, that was about 5%. Anxiety, 27% of people reporting disorder level symptoms, 40% in 18 to 29-year-olds, and it was 19% before. The CDC surveys report that basically we are hitting record numbers in anxiety, depression, trauma, and relapse from substance issues. The groups that affected the most strongly, young people, especially young women, people of color, essential workers, and unpaid caregivers. In other words, the people who are taking care of family members and not getting paid for it. So the groups that are already less advantaged and less privileged in society already. So then what do we know? Well, we know we've been through trauma. We know we're feeling it. We know we're in rough shape. And we can learn from history. It can't tell us precisely what will happen, but it can tell us what happens usually in these circumstances. It's like a weather forecast. We see patterns. And I've been paying attention to suicide rates. And I'm going to get to a hopeful part of this whole presentation eventually. Stick with me through the suicide portion. Here we go. Suicide rates were down in 2020, in the first year of the pandemic, for society as a whole. That's the good news. They were up for young people and people of color. And at the same time, suicidal ideation has doubled. And that's not a direct correlation between ideation and death by suicide, but it's ominous. We know that other pandemics throughout history, epidemics and pandemics, suicide rates go up, especially among vulnerable populations, and especially after the initial threat of the pandemic has passed, when people have to live in the aftermath. And when you look at risk factors for suicide, they are blaring right now. We know substance use is up. We know alcohol sales have been way up through this whole thing. We know that relapses are up. We know that economic stress is associated with higher suicide rates. And we know the pandemic has forced many businesses to close or scale back as a result of lockdown measures. Loss of jobs can mean loss of insurance, or navigating an American healthcare system that is very complicated, that so complicated it hardly seems feasible to those of us in need of mental health care. Social isolation is associated with increased suicidal thoughts. And the main public health measure in many countries to mitigate the spread of COVID has been social distancing. Participation in religious communities helps lower suicide rates, but a lot of churches and community centers have been closed a lot. I hope to God that the suicide rates do go down in all groups, but we're not out of the woods. We're going to stay in the woods for a while. We've built a cabin in the woods. Mentally, we're all going to live. And I'm not saying that everyone is going to have post-traumatic stress disorder, but I am saying that we're going through a traumatic situation and we have a lot of disadvantages. And I believe that because knowledge is good and is better than ignorance, let's take a look at what happens to people with those disorders. People affected by trauma disorder hyper experience the experience that they've had. So a few weeks ago, I had Amanda Knox on my show. And if you don't remember Amanda, she was the case of the American college student in Italy who was wrongfully accused of murdering her roommate and spent several years in jail in Italy before finally being exonerated. And in our interview, she talked about going to see an Italian film at a film festival in Seattle in a dark, crowded theater, and hearing certain phrases said in Italian in that environment set off a reliving response from when she was in an Italian prison for all those years. Amanda had to flee that movie theater because of that traumatic response. So will we all have to run out of theaters or dive for cover when we hear a car engine backfiring, another common traumatic response? I don't know, probably not, but you might be scared of proximity. You might be scared of intimacy. You might hear the word pandemic and freak out a little bit. You might have a greater than expected response to protective gear. I think you'll have issues. If I had to guess, you'll have some issues, which isn't your fault. This whole thing has really sucked really bad, and you didn't do it. You didn't choose it, but you have been through an experience where maybe you've had to watch a relative die over an iPad, or you've had to attend a funeral over an iPad, or you had to attend a wedding that you really wanted to go to over an iPad. We, come to think of it, we might feel kind of weird about iPads in the future. If you've been spending the last several years training to become a psychiatrist or a therapist, at least you have some occupational stability, because those lists are very long of people trying to get in for those appointments. So we're messed up, we're traumatized, and the effect of that trauma will be with us for a long time in all sorts of ways that we can't yet predict. It's the level of situation that made Greta Thunberg famously say, "I want you to panic." But I don't want you to panic. Because one, recommending panic in a mental health situation seems like bad policy. And also because I'm Norwegian and Greta's Swedish, and so we tend to disagree. I want you to be ready. And I'm going to tell you what I think you should do. You should consider trying to find some sort of mental health assistance now, if you haven't already done so, because it's going to be harder and harder to find those those sources. If you know somebody who might benefit from it, you might show them the way to try to find some mental health assistance. You might need to dispel some notions of people who've tried one therapist, it didn't go well, and they swear off therapy, because that's a little bit like trying okra, not liking it, and then deciding you don't like food. You know, maybe you just need to find somebody else. And one of the main things I get asked a lot, well, what should I do? And I say, well, the first thing is understand what's happening to you and give yourself a break. Give yourself some patience and understanding. It's your first pandemic. It's all of our first pandemic. Whatever response that you have to stressful situations or to managing the accumulated stress over the last couple of years will not be wrong. It's what you're feeling. You'll not be weak or dumb or lazy when you feel it. If you still get jumpy watching a crowd scene of people not wearing masks, like in a movie or something, even if it's a movie from long before the pandemic, if you still get uncomfortable about that, even though it's irrational to do so, don't laugh at yourself about that. Be kind to yourself about that. Well, maybe laugh a little bit, but be kind to yourself in that process. And know that a lot of us are probably going to always be nervous about being too close to other people. That might just be with us for a long time. Shaking hands might not come back. And that's because of a threat that no longer exists, but that action might fade away. And here's the big chunk of hope that I'm holding on to is we know the after effects of COVID are coming. We know that even if we don't necessarily have PTSD in the classical sense, we know that it's very likely that a lot of us, if not most of us, if not all of us, are going to have some sort of post-traumatic response, which isn't the same as a post-traumatic stress disorder, but it means that we're going to be dealing with the trauma of what happened. And if we don't stop and consider the possible COVID sources of that stress that we're undergoing, then that's going to hamper our ability to understand what's going on with our psychology. We can share more information than we've ever been able to share before. And this is really at the crux of the hope I was talking about earlier. When they were dealing with the Spanish flu, they couldn't connect with each other on Facebook to give each other support. And I almost hate to use Facebook as an example because there are so many very troubling things about that platform and especially that company. But we are more able to contact each other. We are more able to be close with each other. We are more able to be intimately connected with one another than at any other time in our history. We've never been able to share information more quickly and dispel false information more powerfully than we can right now. And we know that dispelling false information is a huge task that we all face right now as people refuse to get vaccinated and refuse to help their society. But we have those tools. We haven't faced a challenge like this in many recent decades in dealing with the post-traumatic stress of something like COVID. But we've never been better positioned to talk to one another and support one another. We can share information. We can figure out the best ways to get close. Although, you know, let's be careful about how we get close. Tinder use has apparently been way up, as has the rate of sexually transmitted infections. So be careful about how you do get close. But there are ways to get close that didn't exist before. I think the message that I keep coming back to is we have a monumental task ahead, and we are monumentally prepared to meet that challenge. And I kind of try to keep my eye on that big picture aspect of it, because the little picture, the day-to-day, can be so taxing. I'm married to someone who works in a pre-K classroom. I'm married to a teacher, and I hear about the struggles of the burnout and the stress among teachers every day, from my wife, about herself and her colleagues. And I think anyone who does that sort of work, it's certainly not work that I would be capable of. But I think sometimes we can get so burned out, understandably, from the struggles of dealing with the stress every day. But again, big picture, I think we're heading towards something good. And I think that we have the ability to connect with each other unlike we've ever had before. We can know what our trauma response is. We can feel it, we can get ready for it, we can know what to do once it occurs, and we can spot it in our emotional health. We have knowledge and openness and kindness, and it's going to suck out there for a while, but I really like our chances. And so good luck, everybody. I'm sorry this is happening, but I think we're gonna make it in some way at some point. I'm trying to think of some grand statement that isn't unduly optimistic, but I have a lot of optimism, and I have a lot of hope for the future. And I have the knowledge that Sara Benincasa is with us, my friend Sara. So I'm going to bring Sara in and get her thoughts on the preceding matters and see what she has to say. Hi, Sara.
Hi, John. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
This is, as you'll see, I found my AirPods, which is thrilling.
Oh, they look like very glamorous earrings from here.
I'm very excited about it. Thank you so much for your speech and everything. And I'll talk to you soon. And hi everyone. I'm Sara. I'm just going to set my little timer here to keep track so that I don't go over. My background is in comedy, although I don't really perform comedy much anymore. I'm primarily a writer, but and doing stand-up comedy is something that was, for me at least, a way to blow off steam when I was in graduate school to become a high school teacher. So for those of you who are educators out there, I'll start again. Hi, I'm Sara Benincasa. I'm a former high school teacher. I lasted a couple of years. I did AmeriCorps, and then I got my master's degree in teaching with a specialization in English education for grades 7 through 12 in the state of New York, and that was at Teachers College at Columbia University. And so I have empathy, but also endless admiration without the illusion or delusion that if you are an educator, if you are a social worker, if you work in schools, if you work with the public, especially if you work with children, and I know most of you do work with children in some capacity, I do not have the illusion or delusion that you are inherently noble, that every day is an uplifting third act of one of those really inspiring teacher movies that Hollywood churns out every few years. So I have a ton of admiration for you and a little bit of inside experience. I'm 41 now, and I was a baby teacher. So I was teaching high school when I was 23, 24, 25, 26. My kids are in their early 30s now, and they laugh when I call them my kids. I'm still in touch with some of them. They were John mentioned Facebook. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but they were allowed to be my social media friend. At the time, it was MySpace. Once they were 18 and I was not their teacher anymore, that was the rule that I made. And that worked out pretty well, actually, because by the time any of them were 18, I had left the profession. I was no longer a teacher. And so it's been wild seeing them grow up and start families of their own. And sometimes I talk to them. I talked to one of my kids, Theo, who said to me, you were a good teacher. You always are very self-deprecating, but you were good. And I say, was I good or was I fun? Was I a good teacher or was I laid back? Was I a good teacher, or did I not notice sometimes when you guys were up to shenanigans? And Theo kind of paused and said, well, you were a good teacher, but, and I said, I was fun. And if you are, I know some of you are psychologists. Some of you are MSWs, some of you are LCSWs, some of you are employees at various nonprofits, I'm sure. Some of you work at Nest, some of you are volunteers, some of you are members of the public who are interested in advocating for children in various areas of life, pretty much everywhere where they need advocacy, where they need a friend. And you know that sometimes, for those of you who've been in it for a minute, that sometimes the, let's say, tough but fair, or the ones who, the educators or the adults in the kids' lives sometimes who have appropriate boundaries and maybe disappoint them by not letting them get away with whatever they want to, are the ones that they enjoy the most and respect the most. I'm lucky, I feel lucky that my coworkers who I'm still friends with from back then, and the students gave me grace. And wow, I mean, no shade to those of you in your 20s who are teaching high school, but I just don't think you should be allowed to teach teens when you're 23. You should be a kindergarten teacher. I'm so sorry if you're an amazing 20-something who is teaching adolescents, but wow, do I know more in my 40s than I did then. And my friends who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s know endlessly more. I'll get into talking about mental health stuff, I promise, but I just want to make a recommendation that if you're interested in seeing a very funny show that some people I really respect a lot participate in, Abbott Elementary on ABC is a delightful look at public school education. It's very exaggerated, but the combination of incredible love that the teachers have for the students and the threat of burnout is very, very well portrayed, in my opinion. It's broad, you know, it's a network comedy, and it might not be your specific experience, but when I watch that, I know, and I also know because I know a little bit, or have worked a little bit with some people right for the show, I know that there are people involved with that program who have done social work and who have done education. So, you know, I'm not a high school teacher. You know that I have a certain background in the world of comedy. I have a cat named Polly, who will probably be making an appearance at some point. I am a writer for film and TV. I just got finished. The most recent thing that I wrote for was a show called Mystery Science Theater 3000, which you will, if you feel like watching, can watch when the next season comes out. And it's robot puppets making fun of bad old movies, and it was very fun. I write books. The most recent one is this one called Real Artists Have Day Jobs and Other Awesome Things They Don't Teach You in School. There's a few others, and then there's this one, probably most pertinent to what we're talking about today. It's called Agorafabulous Dispatches from My Bedroom. And that is about my lifelong experience and struggle with panic attacks, agoraphobia, suicidal depression, and the healing power of comedy and creativity. And there are definitely some school stories in there. I show you that not to sell my books to you, but just to sort of have a visual cue to tell you who I am. So I'm a writer and those things. I have a podcast called Well, This Isn't Normal, which I began in March of 2020 because the situation didn't seem normal, and it still doesn't, but I knew it was going to become our normal. So I talked to different people about stress relief and how to deal with everything that's been going on around us. I talked to scientists, I talked to students, I talked to comedians, I talk to writers, I talk to teachers, and sometimes I just do breath work and relaxation exercises, and it's fun. Occasionally I act, and I have a full-time job in the philosophy of Real Artists Have Day Jobs. The point of that book is that no matter what your job is, no matter how you pay your bills, if you make your art, you're an artist. And I'm not judging, is your art good? Same way I wouldn't judge if you play basketball on the weekends, if you're a weekend warrior. I'm not judging if you're good at the sport, but you're an athlete. And if you quilt and you work on it once a month and you love it and it's important to you, you're a quilter, you're an artist. If you draw, and let's see if I have an example of, no, I don't, but I am a terrible by, say, fine arts standards person who draws, but I'm an artist. I enjoy it. I'm a visual artist. I don't show it to anybody because it's not for anybody else. If you sing, you're a singer. If you love singing, it doesn't matter if you ever make a dime off it. That's part of the principle of real artists of day job. So I'm a writer. I do make some money off writing, which is lovely. I do make some money off occasional acting. I do make some money off speaking engagements and various things. I also work in the nonprofit space. I'm also a digital copywriter for a very big, very old nonprofit. And so those are all the things that I do. Now, as John very intelligently and helpfully stated up front, and I will echo him, I'm not a doctor. I am not a licensed therapist. I am none of those things, but I'm a storyteller. I'm a writer. I do some journalism. John is way more of a, I would say, accomplished, trained journalist, experienced journalist in the broadcast space. I tell stories and I write about stuff. I write about my own stuff and I write about other people's stuff. And a lot of the stuff that I write about has to do with mental health. Why am I here? Primarily, other than the fact that I was delighted to get to speak to all of you and that I enjoy doing this work, I'm here because I am somebody who has experienced mental illness throughout my life. Like I said, I'm 41. I was 8 years old the first time I had a panic attack. And that became a huge part of my life, a huge part of who I am and who I became. There were times in my life when I was over-identified with it. You know how we can get over-identified with our labels, whether your label is high school principal, your label is senior copywriter. Sometimes I say that, oh, senior copywriter. Yes, I'm the senior copywriter. Well, I'm the senior copywriter because I've been there the longest. Nobody conferred upon me through papal sanction award, but why do I add the senior part? Because my ego, oh, I've earned that. I'm the one who's been there the longest. I also don't have a copywriting partner. I'm the only copywriter. But, and that's a silly example, but we can also get over-identified with labels like, I have bipolar, I have bipolar 1, I have bipolar 2, I have panic disorder, I have agoraphobia, I have OCD, I have this, I have that. Now, of those things, I have panic disorder, I have agoraphobia. Some would say I experience panic disorder, I experience agoraphobia, I experience depression. But that's not my brand. I am not the Kellogg's Corporation, and that is not my, you know, those individual things are not my cereal brands, right? And I think that we can get very caught up in labels, and labels are important. They are. I do think they matter. But I think that sometimes we do get too caught up, or at least let me speak for myself. I have in my life gotten too caught up with what my job was, what my diagnosis was, what my income was or was not, what my neighborhood was or was not, all these different things. And that's some of the stuff that I like to talk about and write about and ask people about. Sometimes the joy of what I do as a writer, and I can't speak for John, but he and I will speak a little bit after this, is that when you have the label of journalist or interviewer or writer or podcast host or something like that, you get to ask questions that other people might consider impertinent. And you get to talk about things and disclose things, if you so choose, that other people might consider, oh my gosh, beyond the pale. And sometimes people say, wow, you're so brave for talking about this. When I have found that a lot of the times, the people who speak to me quite openly about their issues in a broadcast forum, or for, say, I just interviewed people about insomnia for InStyle magazine, you know, whatever it may be, because they need to, and sometimes when I talk about it, it's because I need to, because it helps me. I always say that talking about what's going on in your life does not replace the work of therapy. Expressing yourself creatively on stage, on the page, on a canvas, musically, on a podcast, whatever it may be, does not replace the work of therapy. A daily practice of meditation does not replace the work of therapy. Running does not replace the work of therapy, but these things are all therapeutic. And I think that's really, really wonderful. And I know that some of you provide therapeutic care to people in different capacities, which is awesome, because right now, as you know, from your own lived experience and from hearing what John talked about, the work that you do, whether it is your job or you are a volunteer or you are an advocate and supporter, it's really hugely important. So I'm here because I talk about mental illness. I talk about panic attacks. I talk about agoraphobia, and I talk about stress. That's my thing. That's one of my things anyway. When I'm not writing jokes for robot puppets or writing marketing copy for an email that goes out to millions of people, I'm calling myself a senior copywriter when I'm the only copywriter. I used to have a copywriting partner to share the load, but the great resignation, as John mentioned, has hit a lot of us in a lot of different ways. And she had to go into real estate in Los Angeles instead. And she's doing great right now. Let me tell you, that's my friend who I love, who's awesome. Anyway, it's a real conversational experience here, you know, it's kind of a relaxed vibe if you haven't noticed. And I appreciate that John set the tone by just speaking so frankly about these different things. In my job, hi Polly. Oh, hey. In my jobs, I have seen stress and burnout in the past few years manifest in a lot of different ways. So when I interview people for my podcast, Well, This Isn't Normal, I have heard people from various walks of life with various careers talk about experiencing for the first time teeth grinding at night. Talking to my dentist about how many more cracked and broken teeth she's encountered over the past few years. On the podcast, I've also gotten to hear from people who have nightmares that they remember for the first time. Certainly, I am a sober person. I work a program of recovery that's a 12-step program. It's very famous. I don't need to talk about it, but I do disclose that because business is booming, is my understanding, if you are in the recovery space. And I receive emails, letters, phone calls, texts from more people than ever before. I mean, I'm open about being a sober alcoholic, from people who are friends of mine, family members, and also strangers saying, hey, I don't know, I might have a problem. I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. And, you know, I don't diagnose. I'm not an expert. I just share my experience one-on-one with them and encourage them to seek help and provide a few suggestions for avenues if they're interested. So I have seen all of that. I have certainly seen people's tempers become shorter. I think many of us have witnessed, or maybe we've been the person on social media who had a very big reaction that seemed uncharacteristic. I have certainly seen in my work as a writer, a freelance writer, or I've gotten to interview a lot of people. Like I said, I get to ask those impertinent questions and it's very fun. I ask them with respect, but I get to be nosy. I love that. But people have shared some pretty intense stories about the different substances that they have tried to use to treat insomnia, about the ways in which they have suffered in the past few years. And these are people who may or may not have ever been diagnosed with COVID-19. As we know, it is not so much the experience of having COVID, although there are people, and I know some of you are watching right now, who have experienced the ill effects of long haul COVID, are experiencing them right now. So I don't wish to diminish that whatsoever. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying is that most of us, right, during this pandemic era, even if we've had COVID, we've survived it, right? That's why we're in this room. Most of us are going to get through this time period. But as John spoke to so beautifully, what are the scars that we carry? I just sat with a crew from a local network that was doing a series of mini documentaries funded by a local hospital here in New York City. And every little mini documentary is 5 minutes long. It's going to air on local TV. It's about different health challenges that New Yorkers face. And so for me, anxiety. I got to talk about fight, flight, or freeze. I got to talk about the experience of panic attacks. I got to talk about the experience of agoraphobia, which, man, I have never gotten so many emails about agoraphobia. And my book about agoraphobia came out 10 years ago. I've never gotten contacted so much by people who say, I think I might have that. And I understand why. Now, that was my episode of this little mini documentary talking about mental health. the previous episode they have just finished shooting was with a mother and her daughter in the Bronx who have long haul COVID, talking about their symptoms, their experiences, and where they can access care in New York City, low cost and no cost care. So in the different aspects of my career, including at my nonprofit job, which is in the healthcare space, we serve the American public. I have gotten to hear a lot of stories, and I have gotten to really think a lot about all of this. I know we all have, but also I've gotten to feel my own gratitude and privilege. I've worked from home since 2017 at my nonprofit job. When I write for Hollywood, if I sell, when I adapted one of these books as a feature film, never got made, but I got paid. Most stuff in Hollywood never gets made. I know writers who bought beautiful homes because they sold 7 TV shows that never got made. It's a ridiculous industry. But and nothing is more grounding than working in the nonprofit space, because it's real hard to get upset that you didn't sell a TV show when you're sitting down face to face with a child who's dealing with cancer treatment and their parents and talking to them. Conversely, if in the nonprofit space, this is why I encourage you, if you don't think you're an artist or an athlete, and I'm getting to this little toolkit portion of my little talk here, I really encourage you to have something outside, some kind of hobby, some kind of something, because when I am stressed out from doing the noble work in the nonprofit space and I want to throw somebody through the window, which I can't do because I'm small and weak and I work from home alone, and I would never do that, but you know what I'm talking about. When you want to throw one of your noble nonprofit coworkers who you love so much through some sort of window, and you're having that image in your head, then I go make up some stories and try to sell them. Or I write a cute little story for In Style magazine about write Valentine's to your friends, Or I do something that's not for money whatsoever, hobby. I draw stuff that's gross. Not gross. I mean, it's just not very good. You know what I mean? Or I bake something very badly. Or I have other outlets. That's what I'm trying to say. And that is so, so, so important, because I know that a lot of you are in the caregiving professions. You may also be doing elder care. You may also be caring for children. You may also be going through, to call back to what John was talking about, you may be going through separation. You may be going through divorce. You may be, worse than all of that, falling in love with someone new. Terrifying. You have to protect yourself. You have to have outside things, not to be super codependent about it. But I was thrilled the other day when my therapist, for the first time in 3 years, accidentally told me her child's name when saying that she was going on vacation. Her face lit up. She said, "Oh, I won't be able to do our session next week." And I said, oh, okay. And she said, "Yeah, I'm going on vacation. I'm taking fill in the blank. I'm going to try to teach him to ski." And I saw her face, because she's got excellent boundaries. And to the point where I don't even, I know she's got a child. I did not know the gender of said child. I did not know the name of said child. And I saw her face do the thing. And I just was like, that's cool. Because it's not my job to take care of her feelings as the client. It's my job to give her a lot of money. And I hope you're all making lots of money. That's why we go into care work, right? That's why we go into I know that's why I went into the nonprofit space. Anyway, I felt some delight, because I thought, this is a person who sits and speaks all day to people who are struggling with mental health issues and stress. And she's taken a few days off to take her little kid to learn how to ski. That's very cool. So not everyone is able to do that. And I understand, by the way, that I'm coming from a place of privilege. I get to live in an apartment by myself. I get to have this cool cat who I adopted, who's extremely demanding. Come on, it's a cat. I love you. I get to work at a job where I get health insurance. I get to work at a job where I have benefits. I have parents who, knock on wood, pretty okay health-wise. They live not far away. It's one of the reasons I moved back east. My sister-in-law, who is a special education teacher for grades K through 3, because my brother is employed, she was able to participate in the Great Resignation, leave that job, and do what she really wanted to do, which is in-home behavioral assessment and coaching. for autistic children. I know that some of you are familiar with the sort of discussions around person first language when we're talking about different things. And my sister-in-law and I talked about that recently, and a couple of my autistic friends have said to me, Sarah, we prefer, and they don't speak for all autistic folks, but the reason I say autistic children, not children with autism, just because I've very recently been having conversations with my sister-in-law and a couple friends who are autistic who've said to me, we prefer that you say it. Just saying that. And by the way, if I've said anything where you feel that I've misspoken or not spoken with enough care, I really apologize. As I said, I'm not a professional in any of these spaces, but I am an ally and an advocate. And so I'm always open to learning how to speak in a more thoughtful, inclusive, and loving way about these things. And I have realized for some time that I am so fortunate, so lucky, and so grateful, even though I am somebody who still deals with agoraphobia. Phobia is fear, agora is marketplace. So I sometimes will joke that my diagnosis is that I am afraid of the mall. Absolutely not true. I'm from New Jersey. I love a mall. But there have been times in my life when I was confined to my bedroom because I had not gotten the access to the right care. But because I come from a place of privilege, I eventually was able to get access to that care. I know that a lot of you are integral in helping save the lives of children who otherwise would not have access to that care. And I, in part, although I was not, diagnosed with agoraphobia until I was an adult, part of the reason I got through adolescence was that my high school guidance counselor called my parents in and very strongly suggested that they take me to an outside social worker and counselor. And I'm so lucky because that was what my parents at the time, this was somebody who was very affordable, thank God, worked on a sliding scale. And that's part of why I'm here today. And then, now it's like, I'm so lucky, but I mean, when I was 21 years old, I was so ill with agoraphobia that I wasn't even leaving my bedroom to use the bathroom sometimes. If you've ever worked with or had a friend or family member who is so ill that they are incapable of taking care of their own hygiene, you know how devastating that can be to see. And having since had some friends who suffered in such a way, I know how graphic and how intense that can be. And when you're going through it, you don't realize it, but later, you come to it. Sort of, I don't have children of my own, but it's sort of, I suppose, what I've heard a lot of parents say, that when you're going through it, when you're a child, you don't realize how hard it is for others to take care of you. But then when you have to actually take care of children, you think, oh my God, and you have so much more empathy and grace a lot of times for, say, parents or grandparents you had who maybe didn't do the best job, but tried. I want to get to, before I'm done, before we talk to, I've got like 4 minutes. Before John and I start talking, I wanted to talk about and I know I've gone all over the place, thank you for your patience, but I want to talk about the mental health toolkit concept, which I really love. Everyone has their own recipe. I don't know your life. I don't know your schedule. I don't know how your history of trauma. I don't know anything about anybody who's watching, but I know that you experience stress. And I know that your stress has been heightened in the past few years, even if you have experienced some beautiful things. You've gotten to get married, you've gotten to purchase a home, you've gotten to do this, that, you've gotten a raise, you've gotten whatever, you've met the love of your life on Tinder, whatever it may be. You may have many blessings that have come in during this time, many wonderful things you've achieved, but I know you've got stress. And so I have for many years, one of the gifts of suffering, one of the gifts of suffering and getting through it are the lessons we carry with us. And one that I've carried with me for years is to have a toolkit, sometimes literal. For example, when I go on an airplane, I go in a car, things that at certain points in my life have been unimaginable for me. What do I bring with me? My medication. I usually bring something that smells comforting that won't bother other people, like say a lip balm that smells like mint or eucalyptus, something that I find to be refreshing. I will bring a quartz roller. Yes, I know this is stereotypical, but it puts me right back in my body. Somebody on an airplane might go, oh my gosh, this woman just put serum on her face and is doing this. How embarrassing. What's actually happening is not so much to do with vanity as the fact that this or this helps put me back in my body. If I'm going through the experience of fight, flight, or freeze, my heart is beating fast, my pupils are dilating a little bit to let in more light, I'm feeling nauseous, I'm feeling frightened, I'm going into a panic attack, I'm getting tense. I might have thoughts suddenly that are very intrusive about I'm going to die, this plane is going to crash, whatever it may be. And sometimes it's been on a bus, a train. Forms of transport in general have not always been my friend. What brings me right back to it? Something physical, taking out a little bit of lotion, on my hand. So yes, I've got my medication, but I've also got the toolkit of actual physical things, props. What's this? Some fancy overpriced beauty spray from Sephora. And why do I love it? I'm not going to spray this on a plane, but if I'm sitting here and I'm very anxious, like I was before I came on camera, I was like, okay, aromatherapy, the physical feeling of something on your face in a non-harmful way, engaging in some form of positive distraction can be really helpful. And then what? Look, I look adorable. I would also say that if you have a particular snack that you like, that can be really helpful. A particular essential oil that you like, that can be helpful. A particular reading that's important to you, that can be helpful to bring with you. Also, having a go-to array of breathing techniques can be really helpful. I have a playlist of music that I will listen to kind of prep myself before a trip for like a week before every single day. Because I know traveling is one of my triggers for stress and freaking out. By the time I get on the plane and I listen to that, I'm so relaxed and so pleasant and so friendly as a result. And I'll just close by saying this: if you are able to access care of a provider, it's important. There are a lot of care providers in the world who are wounded healers, who are walking around in a lot of pain, giving a lot to others, and for various reasons will not get help for themselves. And I think it is so, so, so important. I come from a family of educators and a few shrinks, and it has sometimes been a bear of a task to encourage them to get the help that they need, for them to encourage me, but man, does it make a difference. So my recipe is I see my psychologist once a week, except when she's taking her child, who I now don't know the name of, skiing. I see my psychiatrist once a month. I exercise a few times a week. I do my daily meditation. I take my meds. I exercise. I draw badly. I talk on a podcast to strangers about their stress relief methods. I work my job. I enjoy it mostly. Sometimes I just lay flat on the floor and stare at the ceiling if possible. Now, all of those methods may not be for you, but I hope that today, as you listen to John and I talk, that you'll take what works for you and leave the rest behind. And if you get one thing out of this session that is useful to you, I think that's a win. And I feel great about it personally. And I hope you enjoy too. But thank you so much for listening to me. I know I have rambled, but let me bring Mr. John Moe back in.
Hi.
Hi. Was that so scattered but sort of charming at the same time?
Was that the effect you were going for?
No, it is what I'm hoping I got. Was it coherent? What are your thoughts? Was it mostly coherent?
I think you shared what was on your mind. And I think it's helpful. I mean, this is the quest for, is this helpful? Or, how am I to contextualize all that is happening lately and all that's been happening for the last 2 years is something that I often struggle with. And I also think, am I like trying to invent a water engine here? Like, am I trying to invent something that is physically impossible to to kind of have a grand unifying theory of how to cope with the stress of especially the last couple of years.
I like that phrasing, to try and have a grand unifying theory of how to cope. That's your next book title. The grand unifying theory of how to cope. It is.
I'll call it that, and it'll just be all blank pages.
It's a journal.
Yeah, it's a journal.
Well, even just in this, I mean, let's look at where we are right now, right? Thankfully, we have access to this incredible technology, and we've got participants in the room. If you and I were doing an in conversation with, which I hope we do in real life, in front of a crowd someday, because I think that'd be fun, we'd be able to clock people's emotional reactions, right? Like we'd be able to see if somebody laughed, we'd be able to hear it. But because of the nature of the technology and for safety for everybody, the cool thing is that people from all over the world in theory can see this chat and put questions in the chat box. But the drawback is that, you know, how you can't like take the temperature of the room exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've been noticing when I give talks, and I've been doing sort of a blend of in-person and online. It gets to a sort of existential quandary of like, am I talking to a group of people, or am I in fact in a room alone talking to myself? Like, if we were to really like strictly define what I was doing, which one would it be? But you know, that's sort of the struggle that we've been in a grander sense, as we've given up shared living and working spaces. You know, I used to work in an office with a lot of people, and now I work in a room in my house with my dogs. And even trying to get out and, you know, bring a laptop and go work at a coffee shop has been hard, because a lot of the coffee shops in my neighborhood say, no, you can get it to go, but that's about all we can offer you right now. Please.
And you're also, I'm just sorry, I'm jumping on what you just said, but excuse me, I'm thinking, I know we've got at least one person from Saskatoon in the crowd. And so wherever you are in the world, unless you're in a place that's balmy year round, you may not, it may not even be a thing. Like if you go to the coffee shop to get a change of scenery, right? They may not let you sit inside. It might be outdoors, but okay, well, what if it's 20 below, which sometimes it is where you generally live, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's, I mean, I wonder at what point do we start just not trying to normalize it, or not try to like adjust it and say, okay, this is normal except for this, and we just sort of accept the chaos. But it's, I don't know. I mean, to me, the hardest thing lately has been expectation management. I am somebody who always needs to find the hope in any situation, just in order to be able to move through to the next day, you know? So I need to say, and that might take the form of, oh, the numbers for Omicron are going way down, or, oh, the numbers for Omicron are going way up. But you know, that'll come and go. And in my family, I have, you know, my wife and 3 kids. There are members of my family who prefer to look at things in the darkest scenario, so they can prepare themselves for the worst, so that because that makes them feel safer. And I don't want to say that that's right or wrong, but I've been struck with the different coping mechanisms that people have in terms of trying to figure out a future that ultimately we don't really know. Because we were in a situation last summer where a lot of the mandates, the mask mandates, were being dropped, things were getting a little bit more back to normal, and then things got abnormal again. And so I try to sit with the quiet terror of not knowing whether things are about to get a lot better, or, you know, some other letter in the Greek alphabet will return to ruin my life.
I am naturally an introvert, and I know there's a million different ways to use that term, and I'm using it in the sense that to recharge. My dad says that to recharge like Superman in the rays of the sun, he likes to be by the ocean. That helps him. And he loves to be around people he loves. For me, my version of Superman recharging in the rays of the sun is being alone and being quiet, and maybe listening to an audiobook usually. And that has been very easy to do during the past 2.5 years. As somebody who's single, who doesn't have any children of her own. But the danger becomes, the flip side of that is that one can self-isolate. And that, I think, it's a fine line to walk. And I think I've been on both sides of it. And I find that as this whole thing goes on, I see a lot of people continuing to recalibrate, because what worked in the summer of 2020 may not work in February of 2022. One's, let's say one's regimen, one's recipe, one's schedule, the way one approaches this thing. And I wanted to ask you, how has your approach to managing the stress of this time period changed from, say, the first few months of the Panera, le pandemic, to now? Your self-care strategies, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of enjoyed a bit of the isolation, because as a person tending towards introversion myself, it felt like a lot of relief. Like I didn't have to go out and live a life that sometimes is daunting. But over time, I've gained an appreciation for just the essential nutrients that you can get from other people. You know, I used to think, well, you can get it electronically if you really need it, or you could just be on your own and it'll be so much more restful. But I do find myself, if I go too long without, you know, exposure to people who aren't my immediate family, people who don't live in my house, not that they don't count, but they count differently. I can get really bleak. And, you know, so I guess there is, you know, I'm always looking for hope. I guess there is the self-knowledge that you can gain by just sort of at least mentally journaling about your process through a pandemic, of saying, oh, okay, I tried this, you know, this worked really well, this didn't work all that well. I mean, I've been trying to kind of calibrate that as best I can. But, you know, like I said, a lot of it is just giving myself a break. I've been working on making shorter sentences when I am talking about the predicament that I am in with everybody else. For instance, I would say, you know, being a parent is hard, and especially right now during the pandemic, but you just have to kind of move forward and do the best you can, and maybe better days are ahead. So that's a sentence that I'm trying to shorten to, being a parent is hard, period. And just sitting with that self-knowledge, you know, and trying to be a little more Hemingway-esque, at least in sentence construction, if not in actual action. And
this cat, by the way, is a Hemingway cat, to bring up Ernest.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
she's got 6 toes. She's got extra toes.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I just interrupted you for a silly reason, but polydactyl.
And was medic in World War I. Yeah, no, of keeping the brevity of the situation that I'm in, kind of editing on the fly for my own sake. I want to make sure, you know, I have questions too, but I want to make sure that we get, I think, is Allison or Kate? I can't remember which of you is handling the questions. Allison.
Yeah, great. This is great. Let's jump into, first of all, thank you all both so much. We're just so delighted to have you here and feel so grateful for what you've both shared with us today. So thank you so much for being here with us. And please, everyone, please keep dropping your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can in these last few minutes that we have together. I'd love to John, I'd love to ask you, you know, you mentioned, you were just talking about, you know, being a parent is hard, and having kids. What has been your experience, you know, in the ways that you've been helping your children process their difficult emotions around this time, you know, helplessness and overwhelm and anxiety and loneliness. How have you, you know, as a parent, been helping them process, and what are, or other adults in your life, and what are ways that we can work as adults on better recognizing and processing these difficult emotions ourselves?
You know, I think obviously the world has a pretty lousy record of taking kids seriously when it comes to mental health. We have a lousy record as a society of just saying, oh, you know, it's a phase, you'll grow out of it. Or, oh, you think you're having a hard time at school, wait till you get a real job, then you've got trouble. It's not helpful, it's asinine, it's reductive. And so I would say it's gone the best for me and my kids when I've acknowledged the unique situation that they're in. You know, when I mean, my youngest daughter is in 8th grade, and she says, yeah, I've more or less missed junior high. Like that's, and you know, I resist the urge to say, oh, junior high is the worst one. That's the one to miss. Because that doesn't help. But to just say, yeah, I can't even imagine going through what you've gone through. You know, they'll say, well, what would it have been like for you if this had happened when you were in junior high? And I just say, it would be awful. I can't even imagine it. I can't even, and I try to give, and it's not exaggerating. Like, I'm trying to give real recognition to the unique situation that they're in. And that seems to go the best, to, you know, to like almost sounding back to them the pain that they're putting out to me. And if they say like, well, do you think this is all going to be over in a few months? And I can say, I certainly hope so. Here's what we don't know. Here's what we do know. You know, here's home where you're going to be safe and where you can always come to, and you can always be heard. The rest of the world, I just don't know what's going to happen. You know, this part of your life is stable. That part of your life, we're hoping for the best. And, you know, I can't tell them everything's going to be okay, but I've found that they don't need that, as long as they kind of have me reflect that knowledge back to them.
I think that really speaks a lot to what, you know, the work that we certainly do at Nest, and the work that I know a lot of the people that are here participating with us do, is centering their experience and validating their experience and making them feel heard and seen.
Yeah, I mean, the pain is real. Like I sometimes say, okay, if, you know, I'm 50 something years old, and so 2 years of my life equals out to this percentage of my life. But if you're 7, you know, 2/7 is a much greater number, you know, in terms of percentage of a life lived like that. You know, my wife teaches pre-K, and there are kids who have been wearing a mask in public as long as they can remember having memories, because they're starting at 4 years old in that kind of situation. And their older siblings are a little more donked up by the whole deal, because you know, they had a life that was defined in a certain way, and then it got redefined, and then it's sort of turning back, but they can't tell when and how. And you know, if you can think about it in that kind of empathetic terms, it can be useful for you as an adult.
Yeah, that's such an amazing point. Yeah. Sara, I have a question for you, actually. In one of your recent podcasts, you were talking about, it was about anxiety and agoraphobia, and you were talking about navigating the point where reasonable concern bleeds into obsession. And I think a lot of people I think a lot of people are experiencing that feeling when they've never experienced it before. You know, the conditions of the past couple of years, I think, have definitely lent themselves to that feeling. What would you say to those people, and how would you sort of guide them into navigating the next steps of how to deal with that?
I would say that when the rational, reasonable fears of illness, of danger, of whatever it may be, start to become so all-consuming that you find yourself distracted by them in the midst of activities you would otherwise find pleasurable or enjoyable. If you find that racing thoughts are keeping you up at night a lot of the time, if you find that you are not just not happy, but also experiencing a new kind of unhappiness, because there are many flavors of unhappiness. And if you feel this feels different, this feels unprecedented, this feels strange, there's a quality to this that I truly do not like in a new way. Those are all good signals. Also, your gut can be giving you signals. Your physical body can be giving you signals. All material that's been covered way better than I ever could in books like The Body Keeps the Score, by people who work in the world of somatic therapy, et cetera, et cetera. If you are getting signals that there is a new kind of bad happening inside of you, even if it's tolerable, and sometimes especially if it's tolerable, it's a good time to ask for help. Because while it's still tolerable, it's not yet a dire emergency, and that's when you want to get some help. I heard somebody say, I think it was the psychologist and researcher, Dr. Elaine Aron, who's a PhD, who did the first popular book about the concept of the highly sensitive person. And she said that she spoke to, I guess, a professor who she and her husband knew, because her husband is a researcher as well and a psychologist as well. And this man seemed to get so much done. And they asked, like, well, how do you get so much done? And he said, I take the break before I need it. And that profoundly affected me in listening to an audiobook by this researcher, of all the things that she said. And she said a lot of great stuff and shared data and stories and studies. That was what stood out to me the most, was take the break before you need it. So the time when you can still keep your head above water and you can still breathe, metaphorically speaking, that's the time to ask for help. And I say that also as somebody who learned through trial and error, and who experienced plenty of mental health crises where it was very, very bad before somebody else noticed and sounded the alarm. It is so much better to ask for help now, to seek help now, even and especially if you are somebody whose identity is built around caring for others. It can be a knock on the ego when you are an expert, let's say, or an accomplished professional in a particular area, to admit that you need assistance from a different professional in that very area. But it is incredibly important, and I do believe that it will make you more empathetic in your own work, with your own clients, with your own students.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's excuse me, something that's good for us all to remember, to take that break before it gets too dire, because we need it and we deserve it, and it's the only way that we're going to be able to keep going.
I was going to say, it's hard too in a society that sometimes fetishizes not taking breaks and not taking a vacation that you have earned, in terms of days off. We have a culture that encourages you to work very, very hard for someone else's profit and frames it as a virtue on your part. And that's a sucker's bet.
Rise and grind, no days off, hard work only, all this stuff. That's great until you can't get out of bed because you're so exhausted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rise and go back to bed. That's what I
Rise
say.
and go back to bed sometimes, but you start over. If you have PTO, use your PTO. If you have PTO, use it and turn your phone off on PTO if you can.
And if you have BTO, which is Bachman Turner Overdrive, try to use that.
Exactly.
That's for our friends in Canada right there. That one. That was a Saskatoon reference.
Well, unfortunately, I wish we could stay here for hours, but unfortunately, I think that we're out of time for this evening. But I just want to thank you all so much again for being with us and for sharing your experience and your humor. And I think I can speak for everyone when I say it's been a real balm for me this evening. So thank you so much. And we're so grateful to you. And to all of our participants, we want to thank you so much for being with us. And before we close, we're actually going to put up a slide. Kate, if you'll be able to throw that up for me. We're planning some additional virtual workshops on various topics, and we'd love to know what you want to hear about, what you want to see. So if you have time, we would really love for you to take our post-workshop survey. You can scan that QR code or go to that bit.ly link. And also, if some of our previous participants have asked for certificates for participating. So if you want that, you can drop your information in there as well, and we'll get that to you in the future. And we're going to be sending all of the resources that Sara and John shared with us today, and their handles, where you can find them, where you can learn more about them and their work. But we thank you all so much for being with us today, and we're just wishing you to go forward in health and happiness. And thank you so much for being with us.
All right.
Thank you so much for having us. This was awesome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.